Call to order the Board of Education Committee of the Whole meeting on Thursday, February 28th. The Board of Education makes available at least one current copy of the Open Meetings Act, which is posted on the west wall of the meeting room and accessible to members of the public. And request forms, if you choose to speak during the public forum, are located on the table to the left. Lisa Pieper and Aaron Chadwick are absent. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
I move that the Board of Education of District 15 approve the agenda as presented.
A second?
Second.
Your votes, please.
Aye.
So we're going to start with a policy update, Mr. Alexander.
Yes, we spoke at the last Board of Education meeting about what the negotiations group and the BEA have been working on in regards to a policy update to the grievance procedure. So before we get started with that, I just want to first say thank you to the BEA and the board negotiations team for their work on bringing clarity to the grievance process. And this process is designed to do a couple things for us. I'm going to try and hit the highlights of this and explain it as best I can, but without taking too much of your time. The recommendation, first of all, is about keeping kids first and adults second. And it's about sorting out the difference between a grievance that involves students and curriculum or those types of issues, and then taking away the adult issues, which would be second in order of priority, that involve things such as compensation, benefits, leave time, placement on salary schedule, or graduate courses, or those type of things. So we're trying to sort those two issues is the goal of the whole thing. Student issues might be such things as learning environment, educational practices, curriculum, facilities, or plant, or other student-related issues of sorts. But the first thing I want to say is we recognize we need to have a process to hear concerns. And the process we're trying to put into place allows us to hear those concerns on those two separate levels. I think it's a professional approach between the two things and allows us to solve problems from an educational standpoint with a stable preference point. So specifically, through the negotiated agreement, we would change policy 4235, which is the grievance procedure for classified personnel, to reflect these issues as well. And our policy 4625, grievance procedures for certified staff, would fall in line also with this. So as we lump this policy update together tonight, items 3.1 and 3.2 really come together under board policy 4235, where we'd be making changes that would, again, sort the kid issues from the adult issues. And the Board of Education Negotiations Committee, along with the BEA, have come to what they feel is a grievance process that does all of these things we want to do, which is streamline the grievance process, allow grievances to be heard, streamline the process, and provide policy that the Board of Education can feel comfortable about, that staff can feel comfortable about, that allows grievances to be heard through one grievance process, outlines the timeline, makes it all consistent for everybody, and then on the back side of it has forms that address it. So we have the policy that's in place, we have the administrative regulation 4625 that matches with policy 4625, as you can see on the screen, and then we add administrative regulation 4625.1 that includes the grievance concern procedure forms that are also on the final process of it that would be used for area one. So if we had a certified member come in with a grievance, they would follow the procedures in place by the policy, which is step one, talk to their building administrator. If it hasn't been rectified through that process, step two is to write the grievance down in written form using one of these grievance forms and submitting it to the next level of assistant superintendent level, so we can look through it and try to work through the grievance process together. Step three is then final finally bringing it to the board. But it's all outlined for everybody, and it's all spelled out correctly in the procedures. So the change we're making addresses policy of classified personnel, policy of certified personnel, the grievance process, and then updates the grievance forms that haven't been updated since 1994. Again, a thank you to the BEA negotiating committee and the board negotiating committee for their ability to show leadership through this, and I think this is just an opportunity for leadership and decision-making to prevail in the right way for the educational practices of a school.
Are you gonna address reduction in force now?
Again, reduction in force, the next policy update, just as that comes up, one of the things that in reviewing the current RIF policy at Beatrice Public Schools, some thoughts that I want to share with you. First of all, it's very difficult to compare a teacher's performance or criterion in a reduction in force through the evaluation process. So right now we have in our policy, we have a paragraph that states that employee evaluations are part of a reduction in force process. And we don't want that to necessarily be the case, because evaluation instruments are not designed to be used in comparison for a reduction in force or a RIF situation. The criterion for RIF is clearly laid out in paragraph 4 of the policy through this step-by-step process. And so when we start throwing in the evaluations of an employee for a possible reduction in force, we start muddying the water, so to speak. And the Nebraska State Teachers Association has agreed that teacher performance is not a determining factor in the RIF process. It also clearly states in the RIF process that we have that a teacher being reduced is considered dismissed with honor, which is the way it should be. It's not a dismissal based on evaluation. If we have a teacher that's not performing at the proper expectation level, then we should be going through a termination, plan of improvement and a termination notice, and termination of that teacher, which is a whole different process than a reduction in force. So essentially, what we're doing through this, with the elimination of this paragraph, is saying we are dismissing a teacher with honor with a reduction in force if necessary. And also it states in this policy that that teacher dismissed with honor has a recall to that position over a 24-month period in the next consecutive 2 years, which it is also outlined in the policy as well. It's just a little further down. So the purpose for discussing this is that, and we'll see later on in the budget presentation, that we want to avoid going through a RIF process at all costs if we can. But we also know that if it becomes necessary within the budget cycle of the school year, or looking forward to the budget cycle of the school year, we need to have the right policy in place to deal with it. And so, therefore, I recommend, with legal opinion support, that we eliminate that paragraph in this policy that deals with employee evaluation being part of the RIF process.
Thank you. You're gonna address land use then?
Yes. Something that's been, that's come across my desk in the last 2 weeks, well, since our last meeting in February, is our land easements. And so the first thing that I've asked Danielle to do, which I thank you to Danielle for uploading all these, and Renee as well for uploading these documents, scanning them all in, and preparing them for this evening. But in coordination with the Hannibal Park Trail and a Nebraska Department of Transportation Highway Improvement Project, we are, the Hannibal Park Trail project is designed to connect and run across. This area right here is the new school ground out by the high school. So the high school is right there. This is the highway. And then
over here is the Christ Community Church. These are the connecting streets on that land. So the Hannibal Park Trail is designed to run north to south across what is now New School land, and then cut back behind Sack Lumber, the old Compass building, coming along the highway, cross the highway, and then run in front of the high school. So as we talk about this next part of the presentation, that's a visual for you to understand what we're talking about. All right, the Nebraska Department of Transportation is needing to acquire additional land for the continuation and final connection of the Hannibal Park Trail project. So it runs all the way through the community. You've probably walked on parts of it, been on parts of it. But this is one of the final stages of it. In our case, Beatrice Public Schools case, they need a permanent easement, a temporary easement, and improvement easements of the land that we own as a school district. So in trying to sort through all the particulars of this and break it down as simple as possible for everybody to understand, there's 3 easements that they're looking for. And one of them is on the north side of the highway, which I think we have. And we have, this document explains it. And on the north side of the highway, they're looking for 362.47 square feet of a temporary easement. And so they're offering $100 on that temporary easement. And that's just for equipment storage, land movement, dirt removal, and all the things they need to do for that. And on 16,798.87 square feet, they're looking for a permanent easement and offering $5,600. So the total owner compensation for that is $5,700 on the north side. So we also have a map that outlines that, loaded in all this information, so you can get a visual of what we're talking about. This map shows the north side. So that's the old Compass building, Sack Lumber, is that right? Yep, Sack Lumber is right here. So on our land, as it wraps around between these trees, you can see where the property easement attaches to the highway. And the trail would run right behind there. All right, so that's easement number 1, and that's the current offering by the Nebraska Department of Transportation for easement 1. Easement 2 is on the south side. So again, trying to break this down as much as possible, they're asking for 4,644.52 square feet of permanent easement on the south side, which is in front of the high school, and I'll show you the map in a moment, at that price offering, and then also paying to move the electrical meter to our sign that's out there, our LED sign that's on the south side. So that makes a total offer of $3,000 for that side. And the easement, as you can see, the trail would cross the highway right there where there's already a crossing, and then come down in front of the high school, and that's the high school parking lot, so you can see where it come down, and then over here, it connects to the existing trail that's there. So in short, those are the 2 easements that we have seen so far that have come across my desk. Now, I guess what I would like to emphasize is one more easement is to be sent to us, which if we can go back to the original map, and I've talked to the Nebraska Department of Transportation a couple of different times on the phone, and the lead charge in command of the project. Obviously, this easement is another one that they're going to have to be sending. But it hasn't gone through all the stages of the request process yet. And that request process falls into the procedures outlined in the Nebraska Department of Transportation guidelines, and accordingly, we're given a reasonable amount of time to consider the offer. So these offers, we're supposed to have a reasonable amount of time to consider. They think reasonable is a month. But as it falls, this information didn't hit us before the previous meeting, so we couldn't discuss it until committee of the whole meeting. Won't be able to make final approval on it until our March meeting. But I also am a little hesitant to sign these easements without seeing what this third easement represents in terms of an offer from the Nebraska Department of Transportation. The other thing that needs to be understood is that the utilities that run through here also affect where the placement of this trail is. Currently, the trail runs along these streets right here where you see this neighborhood. The trail runs across what are some fence lines, some sheds, some different structures that are owned by these people right here. The trail offers us a sidewalk in the formation of student use, patron use. In the future, when we get a school built here, this trail offers us the ability to provide a sidewalk that's maintained by city maintenance crews. So the discussion point at this level right now is it in our best interest to have that trail sit completely on our land and discuss or negotiate the property easement that will be coming that I haven't seen yet. So the process goes through a field review, it goes through a desk review. There's a comparable market sales and analysis that takes place in the property easement itself. There's the easement offer, which is where we're at with these two right now. And then there's owner approval, which is where we're at on these two easements, but I really don't want to do that until I've seen the third one.
So what was their reasoning on why they didn't put it together as a package?
You know, that's a
Because
good,
it really makes sense that it would be,
all in one,
yeah.
one easement. I don't know the answer to that, but my assumption is.
Aside from maybe they're struggling on the location
It,
because of
it could be.
other property.
And I've talked to Tobias about these owners right there, and has the city talked to them about this, and at the point, this was last fall when we talked about it, at that point, they haven't yet. So, you know, I think we're still in the process of determining where it's gonna be, and I think the desk review is why we haven't seen that. But I also think they wanna try and get started on these that are along the highway, which makes sense, it comes from NDOT, sooner than what they're gonna be able to get started on this, so. If, the other point to take into consideration of this is if no agreement is signed, then we resort to the process of the eminent domain in the state of Nebraska, which includes the following, and it can get to any level of these steps, but it includes a hearing in which if we don't sign the agreements, then we go to a hearing in disagreement with that. That involves county court, also involves district court, at whichever level you don't come to agreement. You can come to agreement in any one of these phases beforehand, but also you would be incurring legal fees there. So there's just a lot to consider as we move forward with these property easements. Now, some of you that have been on the board or been here longer than I, remember that when the high school was built, and this particular plot of land out here, I don't know if there's a record of sale on that plot of land, because there's really not any comparability, or if that land was donated. There's really no record of sale that was provided in this information. So I guess that's a question that I have.
There should be, I mean, there definitely should be.
Yeah,
Isn't that
and,
Blinders?
you know, we just purchased some land there.
The part over there, at the end of that line was where Reimer's property was. The other part in front, I don't think was. Is that part of, that must have been part of Spence, the original Spence
Yeah, it does
purchase.
look expensive. You know, the thing is, we just purchased some land, so there should be a comp on that,
Should be.
because it's sitting right there. I'm familiar with the grant that was written for that. I guess my one comment would be, if we built a school on that property, would we want to have some access from the west, and would that cross that trail going through there?
Great question, and we did discuss that, Tobias and I did. And what would happen if we want to do that. And those sections could be removed, and we will, if we grant the easement and the sale of the land, then this changes my whole comment here. But crosswalks could be initiated in there. In terms of access to that on a street, you know, with access to the north, access to the east, and access to the south, I don't know if it's gonna be necessary for us to do that. So it's a consideration, it's something we wanna, I guess if we wanna get into further discussion about that, we're gonna need to do that in terms of the master facility planning.
Well, I guess my thought would be if you have a trail running through there, I don't think you want traffic coming through there.
Right.
I could see the sidewalk, but you don't want motor vehicles coming across an area where kids might be crossing. So.
Exactly. And there's pros and cons to this whole thing. It's nice because we have a continuous trail throughout the entire community. It's nice because in the event and when we get a new school built there, we get access to a sidewalk for students that, I mean, it's wider than a normal sidewalk, so it's gonna meet all ADA requirements that we don't necessarily have to put in. The con side of it is exactly what you're mentioning, is that in future planning of this area right here, how does that impact us?
I'm sure those neighborhoods don't want cars coming and going, and also, do we want to make it a throughway? You leave it like this, nobody really has any reason to travel through that area, but you put those streets into our property, then they might just be driving, because it's a quick way to go, so. We may not want to have anything going through there.
The one thing I will say, it's probably a really good place for a trail to hook up the entire community. I think there was one leg left on that. I don't know if they've received the grant for that yet to finish up the trail. Do you know?
I think they have.
Yeah, in my mind, I was thinking they haven't. It's a good place to have the trail run.
Yeah.
And even for our students, you know, if they're playing tennis or something, there's a nice access to the tennis courts that we're using and the softball facilities.
I can see, yeah, I agree with all that, and I can see in the future, along the trail, at some point, we'll have to secure it with some sort of, you know, some sort of crossing and fencing options, but again, that would all be part of a future bond issue.
I think if, you know, looking at that there, I think Elk Street is the one on the right. And, yeah, that one. I could see that being made into the through street access to the school property. I don't see any reason we'd have to do both. I don't know if the city would agree with that or not, but maybe if we had just the one access. I don't know, I just think we ought to be 100% in favor of anything that they want to do, keeping in fact in their mind that we may have some exceptions down the road that we might want, and just being able to work with them on it.
Yeah, I would agree, and the people at the Nebraska Department of Transportation, Matthew Taylor is the gentleman that I visited with most at this point, has been very agreeable to work with us on the whole concept that's been presented, so. I really, getting back to Eric's question, I really think that's a good question, is why is this being presented in 3 particular sections? And if we go back to like the north map,
Are all of the easements that they're asking for shown here?
all,
Yeah, my question is, maybe I missed it when you were explaining it, but the part where it comes from the high school property over, Is that the only section that they don't have the information on, or where is the other easement gonna come in?
It's gonna be on the section that runs
All the houses.
by the houses.
Yeah, along the whole
Yeah,
west
that's
side
the
of
large,
the
the
property.
largest section.
Yeah, this
That's
section
what-
right here.
That's the part we don't have yet.
That's,
I thought that was the one we were getting to $5,600.
no, that's
That's that one.
Okay.
this one right here. So, and then this one over here is 3,000. I didn't know if, in researching this, we just didn't know if there was a bill of sale or if this land was donated at the time that the high school went in.
Now, it wasn't donated.
Okay. So we should be able to go back and find it, but, and there are comparable land sales. I might have misspoke that, but all of these easements have been, and in the packet of information, I think, that you have, you can see where these are comparable per square foot. And square foot, I mean in comparability to other sales. So, and you're welcome to come in and look at this information as well, but there are other comparable sales that have been used to develop these easements. But on the north side, you can see in the map that it is from point of crossing the highway to right here. And on the south side, it's from point of, by the high school, it's from the point of being across the highway to where it hooks up to the rest of the trail. So that's just something that is one of those things that we've been working together with the Department of Transportation as it's come across my desk since the last meeting, that I need to update you on, prepare you for in the March meeting to be ready for. I don't know if that third easement will be in my hands before we get to the March meeting. So as we prepare for it, I guess I'll keep you updated as best I can.
Thank you.
Yep.
Dr. Nielsen and Mr. Alexander will talk about master facility planning.
All right, what we've done so far, what Danielle has done graciously, through going through all of the previous master facility planning meetings that have taken place, is she's created an outline for us in an effort to have to go back and rehash everything that's already been discussed. She's put together a timeline of events that have occurred over the last several years, going back to August 24th of 2017, when Superintendent Nareth asked the board to consider having the district put together a comprehensive facility plan. So what she's tried to do is condense all the materials into a PowerPoint presentation that documents everything that's taken place on a time frame. And then eventually get us to a point where we are now, since we've got new board members on place, and we know we need to continue looking at our facilities and ways to create efficiencies in our facilities, and at the same time provide the best possible learning environment we can for our students, got us to a point where we're ready to establish a master facility planning committee, which is comprised of a 3-member committee from the board, and then the parents that have been part of those discussions, and the patrons that have been part of those discussions thus far. What we'd like to do is bring those parents together with 3 board members, formulate this master facility committee, and then expand that as we get more plans in place as to how to move forward with our facility planning in the next year. And be able to have that establish surveys, establish situations where we can go out to the community and talk to them, and be able to present this timeline of events. So again, we're not going back and repeating everything that's been done up to this point forward. So we'll be asking for your
volunteers from the board, 3 of you, to serve on this master facility planning committee. Anything you would add to that?
We are at a stage where we need to move this piece forward because we do need to figure out how are we going to prioritize where we are with our buildings and what are our next steps. And so, very excited to get this process going, because it's been nice after we've had some adjustments, some changes, just to get our feet on the ground, and then now we're ready to move forward.
I will tell you that ironically, as this was on the committee of the whole meeting agenda this morning at 4:30 a.m., Terry, who will also be on this master facility planning committee, gets a phone call that the modulating motor on the boiler at Stoddard Elementary today died of old age. So it's a sad day for us that the modulating motor has died. Funeral services are pending. This is my attempt at humor. Funeral services are pending, but we are in search of a new motor in Lincoln. The point being in all of this is that this is a reminder to us that these systems are old. The boilers are old in our elementary buildings, in our middle school building. Those parts are old, and just like me, at some point, they're gonna die. And they're showing their age now, just like me. So we've got to address this, and I think that's the point that we're trying to make. We've got to move it forward, and it's time to do that.
The point being that from the first day I was on the school board in, I believe in '92, Chris Nelson was talking about boilers. He had money set aside for boilers, and we've had to dip in and take out, replace for all those years. So I don't think we've ever lost a total boiler other than the problem we had in the middle school a few years back. That was about the only one, but that's been around for 22 years. So,
Yeah, eventually these things are gonna become obsolete, and we're not gonna be able to get parts for them. So as we move our way through this master facility planning, those are just things to keep in mind.
Thank you.
Yep.
Next up is a budget update by Mr. Alexander.
All right, I'm gonna tie up. Through this process, last month Dr. Nielsen gave us a great presentation on student achievement. Now we're approaching the halfway point in our budgeting process, in our school budget cycle. So it's time to have an update on that. And I'm gonna lump 6 and 7 on our agenda together, because at the end of this, we'll talk a little bit about staffing, and it's important for everybody to understand where we're at with that. So Danielle and I have practiced this. I hope it goes as smooth as what we've practiced, right? So we'll go ahead and dive in and take a closer look at the budget. The objectives of this presentation tonight, first of all, I understand that it's not a situation where everybody's excited to hear about, but I love it. And so with that understanding, I'll try to be articulate, be meticulous, but also be brief, so I can get you all home, because I know you have busy schedules as well. Objectives are to educate the Board of Education on the history and budget dynamics of Beatrice Public Schools, to bring you up to speed on the budget tracking processes that we currently use and are in place, to update the board on current year-to-date expenditures and how we track that, as well as revenue, and then to communicate concerns of expected proposed legislation and the impact on specifically the 1920 school budget, but even more so, what could possibly be coming our way in the future that's being discussed in legislation right now. So all of this revolves around LB 1059 that was established, and I can't tell you the exact year. Janet might be able to, but
Probably 1989 or 90.
1989 or 90, about the time I was graduating from high school. So the Tax Equity Educational Opportunity Support Act, oftenly referred to as TEOSA, is the bill that defines school finance right now. It's what defines the formula, and you can search it online and look up all the definitions and everything that go into school budgeting right now. So, but to shrink it all down, to take all the details out of it,
and explain it to you, what a lot of our senators call the most confusing thing in the world, it's really not. It's taking a school's needs minus its resources and then determining how to disperse its state aid. Now, will I say the formula works the way it's supposed to at this point? No. But that's because of changes that have taken place since 1998 and even since the inception of the formula in 1989. But there are two specific needs that are based on your membership and your basic funding plus allowances and adjustments. Now, these allowances and adjustments are where the minutia gets deep. And those are all listed under this side of the needs formula. When they take away your resources, the greatest resource that the state of Nebraska has is property, land, and water. But we don't tax water. We tax land. And so when we talk about our resources, we're really talking about our adjusted valuation and our local effort rate. Those are the resources that go into this. Now, underneath of that, there is also net option funding, which there's certain requirements that you have to meet in order to receive net option funding, and allocated income taxes. Every school district receives allocated income tax as a resource within their formula. All right? Now they've added the Community Achievement Plan transition aid newly last year at the end of the legislative session, that we have to continue to look into that as being a part of our resource anyway. But anyway, when you take your needs minus your resources, that equals your state aid. Now, some districts don't get state aid. They're unequalized. I happen to come from a district where we were unequalized. We didn't get anything except for net option funding because we had a positive net option enrollment number, and we got allocated income tax. So in a $9 million budget, we got about $200,000 from the state, comparatively speaking. Beatrice is a little different from the standpoint that they're an equalized school district, so we get about $12,500,000 from the state currently. All right. How does this all apply to us? Where does this break down in terms of history? Very quickly moving through this. Some of you have seen this. Some of you in the audience have seen this before in the PLC, so we'll move through this fairly quickly. But by the numbers, you can see that in 2002, 2003, we'll go to 2003, 2004, we were receiving roughly $6.4 million of state aid. Over the course of time, and the adjustments that have been made to the TIOSA formula, we are currently to where we receive $5.1 million. So you can see that state aid has decreased. At times, it's gone down significantly. 2011-12, when the property bubble started on its rise, down 19%. Overall, since 2013-14, and I go back to, I'm going to reference these years a lot in the next several slides, because this is really when we saw the property valuation bubble start to increase and the shift take place to our local effort rate or taxpayers everywhere in the state. So overall, since 13-14, we've seen a 4.68% drop in state aid, or commitment from the state to Gage County, to Beatrice Public Schools. Overall, over the course of time, it equates to a 1.23% decline in state commitment. Okay? Now, by the numbers, if you're a visual person like I am, this is what it looks like on a bar graph. So those numbers that we just looked at on a bar graph, this is what it looks like. For visual purposes, on a line graph, this is what it looks like. So state aid receipts in history have, especially in the last 6 years, have decreased significantly, over 5%. The reality is, again, my attempt at humor, we have a massive hole in our state aid funding formula in public schools in the state, and it's not just Beatrice, it's everywhere. Because what's happened is we've shifted the monkey of the state's commitment of funding schools to the taxpayers. And we hear that very clearly and loudly now in all of the policy making that's taking place at the legislative level. Now, this is just a graph that was used in the budget hearing presentation, but it just shows you that from 17-18 to 18-19, our valuations went up 0.19% as compared to the previous years where it's gone up 3, 4, 5, 6%. So we're seeing the property tax valuation bubble burst. That's what we're seeing happen, and this is just indication of that taking place. So that brings us to land valuation. By the numbers, again, you can see that in 2002-03, now this is to me astonishing. In 2002-2003, the district received $620 million in valuation. Over time, look at the increases that have taken place to where currently we receive $1.2 billion valuation. So it's basically, over time, it's increased that much. Since 2013-14, we've seen a 5.12% increase in valuation. So again, I go back to that 6-7 year period out where we've seen valuation increases from 6% to 9%. Now that bubble is bursting and we're back down to 0.19%. What does that mean when you take the numbers and you convert them to graphical form? As a former teacher, this makes perfect sense to me. It's L to J. Our graph has increased in valuations. When you show that in a line graph, valuation increases. It's just clear as day. What the reason behind drop in state aid is because they figured out how to tweak the formula, the TOS formula. So when we take that cutoff point where valuations really started to increase and we look at what really started to happen with state aid, again, it's clear as day. In 2011-12, when the property values really started to go up, what happened to state aid? It really started to go down. 12-13, same thing. 13-14, all the way to where we are now. And I don't know if we can that probably won't show up, but it'll show up on the next slide as well, to where we are. Now, that line represents about the highest point of where we were at in valuations. So the blue line is valuations, the red line is state aid, and it just, again, this is just clear as day what's happened over the period since about 2010-11 in terms of valuations to state aid. So I'm trying to drive this point home, which I know you already get. But this is a new slide just created recently, thanks to Danielle and the folks in the office that helped gather all these numbers. How does that impact our general fund levy? Well, in the TOSA formula, that's what we use for budgeting purposes, and there's 4 areas where we collect taxes, or 5, excuse me. The general fund, the bond fund, the building fund, the quality capital purpose undertaking fund, and what we used to have, which was the tech fund. And you can see that over the course of time, depending on what's happened in statute and in the unicameral, we've been under certain restrictions or levy lids in our general fund. Now, the bond fund is voted on by your patrons, so that is completely dependent upon where you're at and what your needs have been facility-wise and voted on by your people. The building fund, at one point, we were allowed to tax up to 15 cents in. Now there's a restriction on that you can't tax that high on it. The quality capital purpose undertaking fund, that's just a fund that was utilized, and it started in 2010-11 when the America's zone bonds were established, and we could take that and establish a tax for it to make quality improvements in our building in the area of environmental improvements of air, mold abatement, different asbestos removal. those types of things that this could be used for and bonded out over time. So that's what the QC Puff, when you hear QC Puff, that's what that means. But they're a result of the Zone America bonds that were established in 2010-11. Our tax levy breakout by fund, we try to take that information that you just saw, and the blue represents our general fund. The red, this red, represents our bond fund, which you can see at this point, after 2018-19, or 2017-18 has expired. So we don't collect a bond tax anymore, because everything's all paid off. The building fund, you can see where it used to be 14 cents, is now all the way down to just under 2 cents. The Quality Capital Purpose Undertaking Fund, we're still paying on that, and for projects that we've done, and we'll continue to pay on that through what I think is 2030. And then the Tech Bond Fund, which is, at this point, it was eliminated last year in the legislature. So we don't have access to that anymore. A lot of people establish the reason for our drops in state aid being related to our enrollment numbers. Well, again, I'll repeat, it's not that enrollment numbers aren't part of the state aid formula, because they are. But in reality, our enrollment is not the biggest reason for a drop in state aid. The biggest reason is valuations, and these numbers tell that story effectively. If we go to the next slide, you can see that, which are just the numbers previously in graphical form, because I love graphs and visuals, that our numbers have remained fairly static over time. We haven't seen a severe decrease in enrollment. Why is this important? Because it's important because we have to understand we're going to have a goal moving forward. And a goal that establishes sustainability for Beatrice Public Schools for a long period of time. In short, we're always going to have students here. And our enrollment history shows that. We're always going to have probably a consistent number of students. Now, are there going to be years where we see a little dip? Yeah, I think you'll see that in any school in the state of Nebraska. It's crazy how sometimes on a 10-year trend, you'll see certain odd numbers of years where the odd years seem to have enrollment declines and the even years seem to have enrollment spikes. I don't know if that's related to the weather, or the winter it was, or whatever. But, we all have heard those jokes. But the bottom line is, in our financial strategic plan, or in our strategic plan where we address finances, our strategic parameter is that we will maintain a fund balance sufficient to cover at least 2 months of normal operation. For us, currently, 2 months of normal operation means we spend about $1.9 million per month on average. So that means roughly $4.5 million. I'm telling you, in the environment that we're in now, that 2 months isn't enough. We just came off of a government shutdown, and who knows when the next one's going to be. Part of our funding comes from the government. If we experience a long-term shutdown, we don't have access to the federal funds that we receive, and we usually have to submit request reimbursement to get those, we could be in an issue. So how do we put the pieces of the puzzle together to address this? Well, in order for us to understand that what we communicate to you, we deal with in an office on a daily basis. We're looking at these numbers daily. Sometimes the number tracking can be very striking, and Jackie will appreciate this, Jackie Bornmeyer, because she'll know that if we accidentally give the superintendent the yearly budget estimate and not the monthly budget estimate, he can have a little bit of stress. But what we do is we track everything on a monthly basis, so we're watching it constantly to make sure that we're where we need to be. These are just tracking documents that we use, and we went all the way back to 15, 16, so we can compare numbers each year, each month as to where we're at, and we can talk about what percentage we've used and what percentage we've received. So as we look at 18-19, now I just told you that we spend an average of $1.9 million a month. It's just a tick over $1.9 million per month. This shows you since September, the beginning of the budget cycle, October, November, December, January, what we spent each month. What percent of the budget is used, what our revenue's been, what our total revenue is for the year, and then what percent we've received of that, so we can make comparisons and analysis to this to the previous years before that. So we're tracking this on a monthly basis. Sorry. On another tool that we use is our revenue, bills, and payroll tracking analysis that compares all of the funds we have, all the revenue we have in the district, broken down by account. So the general fund account, this tells you what revenue we've received on a monthly basis. So the revenue is green because revenue's good. And that tells us that in terms of total revenue for the district in the general fund at this point, we've received $9.2 million. All the other funds are added in there, which brings our total revenue to $10.9 million. Our bills per month are listed on this line right here, so we can tell you what we're spending in bills every month. The thing to understand about that is there's a difference between bills and payroll, and what we're spending on payroll per month. So that brings our total to $11,291,281. So in looking in comparison, if we take all the district's revenue, we're right at $10.9 million. If we take all the district's expenses, we're right at $11.2 million. So currently, we've outspent our revenue $243,503. Right, so that number's
343,
903. Now that would be alarming if you didn't understand everything that we deal with on a daily basis. So, but this is just another tracking tool that we use to be able to go back and collect. The other reason it would be alarming is if we didn't understand that in the months of January through July, we start to get special ed reimbursement, which helps us go back and recoup some of that expense we've had in the first half of the year. So that makes up a little bit in the second half of the year. Okay? Another tool that we use is what we call our state aid, this is just simply revenue that the district gets from two of its major sources of revenue. Taxes and state aid. This line right down here, this is the 18-19 school year, so you can see what we can look instantly at what we've received in taxes from Gage County, from our levy, from our taxpayers. We can take a look at that and see what we've received automatically. This number right here, state aid, it could actually be filled out all the way across because we know that number is going to be static for 10 months. State aid is dispersed in 10 months over whatever that total amount is, you get it over a 10-month time period. Now, the only thing that ever concerns me about state aid is that in 1998, the state got into a situation where they didn't have the money to pay state aid. Are we there now? I don't know. But if we get to a situation where that state aid payment stops, and they say during the months of February, March, and April, we're not going to be able to pay your state aid, we got to have reserves to be able to pay our people and get through that time period. So that's just something that in history has happened before. It's been a long time. Okay? So every day we're looking at, or every month, we're looking at our general fund disbursements by the numbers. We're comparing them to the previous years. You can see that just like every business, input costs continue to go up, but it's crazy how frugal Beatrice Public Schools has been over the course of the time period that we're talking about. In 2003, 2004, total disbursements for the district were $16.1 million. last year, 2017-18, total disbursements were $23,075,000. So over time, this equates to only 0.02% increase. That's phenomenal. Also, over the entire process, over all those years, it's a 0.03% increase. But you can see that the total general fund disbursements have not been, there has not been a spike ever that equates the same type of spike we've seen in revenue loss. That's good. In terms of general fund cash flow, these are the reserves that I referenced earlier in the presentation. Every month, we're looking at what is it that we actually have to tap into in the event that our revenue would stop. We would all of a sudden not get taxes, or we would not get state aid. What do we have in our savings account? You can see since 2015-16, in September, we had about $7.5 million. 17-18, and comparatively speaking, 8.1. But if you look at this trend line where it's been, and we knew this, we knew that we were going to have to dip into reserves, we've seen a consistent loss in where we've been in the previous year over time. So we take the most recent month, which we have all the financial data for, which is January. Last year in January, we had $6.4 million in reserve. In 16-17, 6.1. In 15-16, 6.9. You can see the trend. Now, the mistake I probably made is not putting this in graphical format for you and presenting it to you, but you can see the trend is that we're decreasing, or we're dipping into our savings account every single year at the same time. The most, and the reason the month of April is highlighted is because it's the leanest month in the budget cycle. And it is for every school, because at that point, you've taken your last injection of tax boosting that you're going to get that comes in January. So your tax revenue is going to be fairly lean for February, March, and April until you get the second collection of taxes, which comes in May, and then you get some trickle in June, and you hope that everybody pays, you hope that everybody, that all back taxes are paid, and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is, we can't control that revenue stream. We can only control what we spend. That's our only form of control, and I'll reference that later on. So, that brings us to, over time, how is our general fund budgeted expenses compared to what our expenditures and our revenue are? Well, Beatrice Public Schools can feel pretty darn good about where they've been in terms of what their revenue is and what their expenditures are. They've stayed pretty tight to where they're at. But because of legislative mandate and the games that have forced schools that we've been forced to play, and statute changes and changes in the TIOSA formula, you can see where we've had to elevate our budgeted expenditures over the last 6 or 7 years to keep up with what is happening to input costs and revenue, because revenue's gone down. The thing that concerns me looking at this graph is the gap that's starting to happen right there. You notice that that gap was a little wider at certain times. Now that gap is starting to shrink. And as that gap shrinks and our budgeted expenditures are capped because of growth, we used to be, at this point, we were at 3.5% growth. This year, in 16-17, we were at 2.5% growth. This last year, we were at 1.5% growth. So we can't build our budget's expenditures high enough to keep up with what's happening in terms of our revenue and our actual expenditures. That gap is starting to shrink. When we look at what we expend per year, or what we budget per year in expenses, out of a $28 million budget, 75.4% of our budget is in salaries and benefits, or 21,290,000. When we break that down even further, this little chunk of the pie right here in these multicolored numbers are representative in this little black chart down here. So taking out all of our salaries and benefits with the exception of security, because security we contract that in an interlocal agreement with the city. Most of that is SRO salaries and benefits, but the rest of it is what we pay in security around our district for security cameras, doors, locks, all those improvements that we make. That equates to about $92,100 of budgeted expenses. Maintenance of plant, $521,000. Operation of plant, $598,000. Now keep in mind, these are budgeted expenses, not actual. General administration expenses, which means $105,000, those are things like mail, expenses that are related to executive services that come into play. I combined our high ability learner, staff development, curriculum and assessment, just because that made a big enough chunk of the pie to represent. It's $178,100, so 0.6%. Transportation, this is a big one. We budget $795,000 for transportation. Thank you to Renee for getting all these numbers together for us. But in actuality, we spent last year $478,000 worth of transportation. And thanks to Jackie Bornmeyer for that. So roughly, we budget 2.8% of our budget is a fixed cost that we know we're gonna have in transportation. Utilities, 1.8%. Last year we spent $498,000. This year we budgeted $500,000. Now the other thing that you might ask is, well, what are all these other expenses? What is that? What does that include? I'm gonna throw out some just not everything because we could be here all night, but things such as property vehicle insurance, welding supplies, classroom supplies, equipment, desks, chairs, etc. Technology, speech pathology, physical therapy, occupational therapy services and supplies, deaf education services and supplies, visually impaired supplies, woodworking, transfers to our athletic and budget fund. All of those things make up all this other expense category. This is where we have the ability to fix the things that we need to fix when they go wrong, like a boiler modulator. That's where that comes out of. These are all, realistically, from this little sliver all the way around, are expenses that are already spent before we ever crack a book. Which takes us to the next slide. Before a bus leaves the barn, before we turn the lights on, before we ever crack a book, 75% of our budget's spent. There's also another little chunk represented right in here that you saw on the last slide that represents budget that's already spent. So 24.6% of our budget is all other expenses outside of salaries and benefits. Okay? In essence, what a lot of this is, to a lot of other people that don't watch it on a daily basis, it's kind of like being in a snow globe. All right? So, as I talk about these numbers, I'm sorry if it feels that way to you. So there's times when it feels like this to us, and we're watching it on a daily basis. Go back 2 slides. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. Where that puts us in current year-to-date expenditures with all funds is currently, out of our $28 million budgets through February 20th, our $28 million of budgeted expenses, we've spent $11.2 million. $8,348,092 of that is in salaries and benefits. All the other expenses, we've spent $2.9 million, or 26.1% of our budget. So that's where everything is tied up at in terms of our district currently through February. Which, trying not to get ahead of myself, is a lot like being in the snow globe. But the thing that we have to do is step one in moving forward, we have to understand this, is that 75% of our budget is spent before we, and actually it's higher than that. But just for argument's sakes, 75% of our budget is spent before we ever crack a book at the start of the year. We have to continue to plan, and then we have to put those plans into action, and they're not always easy. Trust me, I don't like to be the one to deliver this news. I would rather be talking about the great things in the Friday email that go out that we're doing in our schools. But in order for us to maintain and sustain, we have to talk about difficult things at some time and put plans into action. So we've been talking about those. What are our options? What do we do from here? First of all, the one thing that I'd recommend to you as a Board of Education is it's not going to be easy, but you have to maintain the limited revenue stream the district currently experiences. What I mean by that, you can't cut your property taxes even if things are improved in terms of special education reimbursement and state aid. As much as people would like to see that, you can't limit your revenue stream and gain ground to get the 4 months of cash reserve that you want to have. We just have to be realistic about that. And the numbers show that. Beatrice Public Schools has been a frugal district and will continue to be a frugal district. But we also can't squeeze blood from a turnip either. Control. We cannot control our revenue because we never know from month to month, year to year, what that's going to equate to. A lot of times we're at the whim of the legislature, and I shouldn't say the whim, but we're at the mercy of the legislature and what's decided there, how that's going to impact us. We can control our expenditures within reason. I don't want to negatively impact kids. I don't want you to negatively impact kids, but we have to control our expenditures within reason. And the only way to do that is for everybody to understand where we are. And then we have to utilize a combination of approaches. And this is where other efficiencies have to be taken into consideration. Energy conservation and energy efficiencies in terms of upgrading buildings and flexibility of staffing. Can we create more efficiencies in our staffing if we create efficiencies in our buildings? And other combinations and options that might result from that. Reductions. We might have to look at reducing programming, reducing services, reducing staffing utilization of attrition as our first means, and reduction in force if necessary. I don't want to be the one to have to deliver those letters, but I also know the parameters in which we've been given that we have to live within. I'm not saying that we're going to riff anybody. That's not our option at this point in time. We want to use attrition as much as possible before we ever get ourselves into that situation. But we have to be smart about using that option when it's available to us. And they're tough discussions. They require our teachers to teach more of a load. They require us to look more heavily at what we expend our money on a daily basis. But we have to be able to access attrition when it presents itself. Those are the discussions we're having with administrators right now, and building administrators right now. You have to be willing to take a look at that when it presents itself. Not fun, but it's what we have to do. So those are our options. I know this, our plan for the future's got to be better than this one. So trying to end on a positive, humorous note, I wondered how the school district would make up the budget shortfall. These are teachers parking. So that's where we are. I apologize if that took longer than necessary, but any questions?
They had parking meters.
On transportation, can you tell me what last year's figure was again, the actual figure? Is that what you budgeted?
Yes. Last year, we spent $478,000 on transportation.
And we budgeted 795,000.
Right, because part of that transportation expense doesn't include activity, because that comes out of the activities and gets reimbursed into the general.
Okay, thank you.
Jason, I always like to look at benchmarks, and I know you can't look at benchmarks as far as revenue because every district is different as far as land valuations and all that type of fun stuff, but
is there any way, or is there anything out there that does give us some benchmarks on expenses on like-sized schools? Or is that even a possibility to get in this education realm? To see if we're even within reason, comparably to somebody else.
Probably the most comparable, it is available, like, if you go from district to district and look at their annual financial report on the NDE, audits, in my opinion, are more accurate, and then we don't have access to other schools' audits unless we went to other public service agencies to look up their audits. But one of the thing that probably is the most telling of that is cost per pupil. And when we looked at that in the fall, the one thing that we found is Beatrice has always been behind, and I didn't include that slide, maybe should have, but that's a great question. And our cost per pupil in Beatrice has always been lower than the state average. Since 2001, 2002, when I think we looked at it. So that's probably as close of a benchmark as I could give you off the top of my head. Annual financial reports would be another access point within the NDE website.
And then second question is the 4-month cash reserve, is that, again, being new, is that our policy or is that a kind of a statewide general, what most school districts shoot for?
That's a great question. And it's a statewide general rule of thumb. The NDE actually recommends that when we go to our trainings and so forth. They recommend that you have a 4-month cash reserve, just from the standpoint of their historical perspective as well, over what they've seen in the course of time, whether it be federal reduction of funds. It was interesting, and it's interesting that you asked that question, because this morning in the Zoom meeting, one of the things that I heard from the Nebraska Council of School Administrator leader, Mike Delaney, Dr. Delaney, is that in March, on March 19th, we will hear the NDE budget. The NDE, their budget will be submitted to the state, just like we submit my budget to you. That will go to the state level to be heard by the Revenue and Appropriations Committee, and that's where Dr. Bloomquist will make his plea to the state for as much funding as he can possibly get. Really, the NDE budget becomes our budget as individual school districts, because once they have that number, then that's how they determine how it's all dispersed to us. So I hope that answers your question.
Is there any other questions? So we're through staffing now? Is that complete?
Yes, that really, the
Okay.
thing about staffing was at the end where we talked about options that we have and where we are in terms of salaries and benefits. Our administrative team, we've been having discussions with them about how can we access attrition to the best of our possibility, to the best of our ability right now, to have to avoid rifts. The thing I want to make clear to everybody is that my crystal ball is not clear enough to even see what's going to happen at the end of the legislative session that we have approximately 55 days left, and how that's going to affect us. So I don't want to make any promises I can't keep, but in terms of staffing, our best, most humane option in reducing our costs when it comes to where the majority of our budget is tied up in is through attrition.
This is the proper time for public questions and comments on any topic. Would anyone like to address the board?
If there's no one addressing the board, there is, great. I'd just like to say thank you all for coming, because I know this is boring as heck. I know you really probably would rather be watching a lot of other exciting drama on TV or whatever it is you're
Oh,
doing.
no. Oh, no.
But I appreciate your attention span.
This is edge of the seat. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I move the Board of Education of District 15 adjourn.
Your votes, please. All in favor? We are adjourned.
Janet, 1990.